You would not last a day because in Rome, in the second half of the 1st century of our era, the primary combination of threats is a deficit of water and salt under the open sun of the arena, compounded by impact loads, blood loss, and heat stress. At the opening of the Flavian Amphitheater under Emperor Titus in the 80th year of our era, the spectacle lasted 100 days, and even for trained fighters, every 30 to 40 minutes of active work on the sand at temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius meant sweat losses on the order of 1 to 1.5 kilograms, a drop in plasma volume, and cramps. The Ludus Magnus opposite the eastern wall of the Colosseum imposed a regime in which the mass of the armor reached 15 to 20 kilograms, and a scutum-type shield covered the torso but worsened heat dissipation. In practice, the body already loses reaction speed by the 12th to 15th minute of sparring. However, the crowd expects a spectacle and forces the episode to drag on. The clock runs in hours. The fall of sodium triggers dizziness, and small cuts on the forearm or thigh add another 200 to 300 milliliters of blood loss, which exhausts the oxygen reserve. Here, failure starts sooner than the mind can adapt. Let us examine the zones where the system reliably breaks even the strong: water and ration, housing and temperature, injuries and infections, training and equipment, law and discipline, transport and logistics of the games, money and prices, communications, signals, and the crowd. The practical value of understanding the mechanics of the environment is straightforward. By knowing the thresholds, time to dehydration, armor mass, infection speed, price lists, and schedules, it is possible to model outcomes without romance and myths. Specifically for Rome, Capua, Pompeii, and the provincial amphitheaters of Gaul and Britain, the constraints are set by the climate of a Mediterranean summer and the oceanic wind. The norms are dictated by the editors of the games and the owners of the schools, and the technologies rest on wrought iron, raw sand, and the vinegar water drink Posca instead of modern isotonic solutions. Now an athlete drinks a solution with sodium and potassium and receives aid within 8 to 10 minutes, whereas then a colleague medic came with bandages, screw tourniquets, and copper instruments within 2 to 5 minutes, but without antibiotics and cooling packs. The context of the era sets the initial conditions. In summer in Rome under the arena sun, temperature easily rises above 32 to 35 degrees Celsius, and sand gets into footwear, increasing friction and lower leg injuries. In Capua, the schools recruited people from prisoners of war and debtors, and kept a schedule with morning melees, and a daytime weapons practicum totaling 2 to 3 hours, which for a novice meant a loss of up to 1% of body mass per session. In Pompeii, the amphitheater standing there already by the 70th year before our era provided an example of a provincial venue with short passages and stairs at a steep angle of about 30 degrees, and this complicated the evacuation of the wounded. In Gaul and Britain, humidity and wind reduced overheating. However, they cooled muscles in the shade, and by 2 in the night in the barracks, chills and muscle spasms began. Instead of a smooth stadium surface, there is a loose sand layer several centimeters deep that absorbs the energy of every step and speeds up fatigue by many tens of percent. Local logistics lock in the vulnerability. The Ludus Magnus is connected to the Colosseum by an underground passage roughly 50 to 100 meters long, and this proximity saves minutes but deprives the body of a pause to restore heart rate. On provincial tours across Gaul and Britain, troops moved along stone-paved roads, and a day's march amounted to 20 to 25 kilometers, exhausting them even before the fight. The water reserve in a water skin is about 1 to 1.5 liters, while the need under load and heat is 3 to 5 liters per day, so a deficit forms by midday. Now, such gaps are bridged by drink stations and protocols. Then they were compensated with vinegar Posca and salty porridges, which reduced the rate of dehydration but did not remove heat stress. In practice, the Roman training and show system worked like a tuned machine. However, its margins for error were measured in a quarter of an hour, not in days. At first light in Rome, around the 90s of our era, when the Ludus Magnus stood active beside the Colosseum, the first failure threshold forms within the span of one training bout. Under armor of roughly 15 to 20 kilograms and a scutum covering almost from chin to knee, a fighter working on sand loses close to 1 liter of sweat per hour once the sun lifts and the arena warms beyond 32 degrees Celsius. The mixture of dehydration and sodium loss slows reaction by the 12th to 15th minute, long before technique degrades visibly. Posca, the vinegar and water drink issued in ladles, offers acidity and some microbe safety rather than true electrolytes, so the heart rate stays high and recovery stalls during the short walks through the underground passage of 50 to 100 meters back to the barracks. In practice, the body mass drops by about 1% across a morning cycle, and that shift alone reduces maximal power and increases cramp risk for the second session. The ration that sustained this body was not steak, but barley and beans. A standard bowl of barley bean mash with salt and a little oil yields about 2,000 to 2,500 kilocalories across the day, with most energy arriving as complex carbohydrates. Compared with a modern athlete's balanced macronutrients, this meal lowers peak output over a 30-second burst but maintains steady work across 30 to 60 minutes. Coarse fiber slows absorption, so a fighter enters the arena with a fuller gut and less blood available for the skin, increasing heat storage under the mail and helmet. On days with 2 practices, the second bowl arrives after a pause of 2 to 3 hours, which is enough to refill the stomach, yet not the intravascular volume. Instead of sugar water and sodium today, then they used salty gruel and a cup of posca, which delayed thirst but did not restore plasma. When the sun stands high over the Colosseum in July, the surface temperature of the sand exceeds 35 degrees Celsius, and a standard bout or sparring sequence lasts 10 to 20 minutes. With scutum lifted and the gladius hand locked, sweat is trapped along the forearm guards and trickles to the fingers, reducing grip strength by a few percent through simple skin hydration. 2 liters of sweat lost by midday translate into a 2% body mass reduction for a man of about 100 kilograms in full kit. And this is the classic threshold where cognitive speed, fine motor control, and leg power begin to fall in measurable steps. A single water skin holds 1 to 1.5 liters, so even disciplined sipping leaves a deficit after the first practice cycle. The result is a heart that keeps beating near its upper zone while pace and accuracy degrade in the second cycle. Blood loss compounds the fluid story even without dramatic wounds. A shallow cut on the thigh or the forearm during a shield rush might bleed 200 to 300 milliliters across an hour if left under coarse sand and friction. With an adult's total blood volume near 5 liters, losing 10% across a day shifts the fighter toward early shock, cool skin, faster breathing, dizziness when rising from a crouch. In the Ludus Magnus, medics bind gauze and apply pressure within 2 to 5 minutes after a drill ends, but there are no antibiotics and no cooling packs. A man who ends the morning already down half a liter of fluid will meet the editor's schedule in the afternoon with less oxygen delivery and more lactate. The next hit, even a small one, forces a pause that the crowd reads as weakness and the trainer marks as a fault to correct at cost. Salt is the simple lever that the ancient kitchen strains to supply. A ladle of garum, the fermented fish sauce common in Rome, might add the equivalent of several grams of sodium across a meal, and a pinch of rock salt on barley porridge helps retain water for the next hour of work. However, the balance is narrow. Too little salt and cramps start in the calves during the first shield drill. Too much and thirst intensifies without a matching water allowance. The cook's solution in schools from Capua to Rome is salted beans, old bread soaked in posca, and a handful of olives at dusk. Compared with modern electrolyte solutions that list sodium and potassium in millimoles, the ancient kitchen worked by habit and taste, so intake varied. On days of public display, the ration was kept light before noon to avoid vomiting under stress, which shifted all mineral replenishment into the evening and left the afternoon dangerously dry. Around the 160th year of our era, the physician Galen, serving gladiators at Pergamon, wrote about hordeari, the barley men, and set a protocol that favored endurance over leanness. His notes described barley porridge, broad beans, and a measure of oil, plus a drink made by dissolving plant ash in water to supply calcium. That regime lowered the cost of food and produced solid bodies with an extra layer of subcutaneous fat that could reduce the depth of superficial cuts by a few millimeters compared with lean soldiers. It also made bursts slower over the first 5 seconds, but steadier over 15 minutes of shield work. The trade was explicit: less speed for more staying power, a sensible choice in bouts scheduled in series. This is the line where diet becomes armor, yet it still depends on water in the first hour of heat. The provincial amphitheater at Pompeii, in use by the 70th year before our era, shows how the same problem scaled outside Rome. Vendors sold cups of sour wine and posca at the stair landings, and fighters moved through short vomitoria tunnels that delivered them into sunlit sand within seconds. Before the eruption in the 79th year of our era, announcements on walls promised games with beasts and pairs of fighters over 2 days, which meant a rigid sequence with minimal breaks. In this setting, a pair that fought late in the day entered with the arena already radiating heat gathered since noon, and a 10-minute exchange cost another liter of sweat. The water that mattered was not in the stands, but in the barracks, where a jar held a few liters for a room of 2 or 3 men. The consequence was predictable: cramping in the second sequence, sloppy footwork, preventable falls. A plain case makes the chain visible. A Thracian-type fighter in Rome, midday, completes 15 minutes of drill with heavy scutum presses and 3 shield rushes across a 10-pace lane. He loses close to 1.5 liters of sweat, drinks half a water skin of posca, and eats a small barley cake with salt. An abrasion on the knee bleeds slowly into the sand, adding perhaps 100 milliliters lost before binding. The afternoon brings a real bout of 10 minutes under a temperature above 33 degrees Celsius. In the 5th minute, the calf cramps, the shield lifts half a span lower, and a gladius strike glances up to the shoulder rim. The medic binds within 3 minutes, but the evening tally is 2 liters of water deficit and 400 milliliters of blood lost. Recovery will demand 3 to 5 liters of fluid and a full night, which the schedule will not provide during festival weeks. The micro-conclusion is blunt. Without timely water and salt, the barley bean ration that once made the hordeari dependable becomes a liability by the afternoon, because plasma volume and sodium fall faster than the kitchen can replace them. A fighter who starts the day even slightly underhydrated will meet the second session at a measurable disadvantage in grip, footwork, and cognition, which increases injury risk and spirals into further fluid loss. The next module in the chain is shelter and heat management, because the dormitories, baths, and training yards of a school either slow this spiral or accelerate it. Now the lens shifts from the bowl and the cup to stone walls, steam rooms, and the summer air over Rome, Capua, and Pompeii. At the turn of the 9th decade of our era, when the Ludus Magnus functioned as Rome's central school beside the eastern flank of the Colosseum, the day's first thermal trap forms before the first drill. Cells line the inner corridors in tight rows, each roughly 2 by 2.5 meters, with a narrow doorway and a small window high under the lintel. 2 men sleep on straw pallets, and the air still holds the heat gathered from the previous afternoon because the masonry walls, half a meter thick, release it slowly through the night. In July, pre-dawn, indoor temperatures settle near 24 degrees Celsius, even when the courtyard cools to 21, so a fighter rises already warm and slightly dehydrated after 8 hours of dry breathing. The muster comes in the first hour after sunrise, and the body is asked to move from warm rest to armored work without a true cooling phase, so the pulse is high before the first step into the yard. The complex itself was raised under Domitian around the 90s of our era and anchored to the amphitheater by an underground corridor, a design that shortened transfer time to a few minutes yet kept air movement low. The practice arena in the central court is oval and ringed by a shaded portico with columns, and the surrounding blocks stack 2 stories of cells with service rooms at the corners. Storage for shields and helmets sits behind the trainer's area, and a water cistern occupies a corner near the kitchen. Ventilation relies on open doors and the draft generated across the courtyard, which is reliable only when the sea breeze reaches the esquiline. On windless mornings, humidity hangs, and by the 3rd hour, the shade of the portico reads comfortable, while the open sand holds heat that rises through greaves and soles. The architecture prioritizes control and speed of deployment more than nighttime comfort or cooling. The school routine solves discipline but loads heat. Before the 2nd hour, a guard issues a small bread ration, close to 200 grams, and a ladle of pasca. Then the first drill starts in the yard and runs 20 to 30 minutes. A short pause allows gear checks, and a second block repeats forms with the wooden sword for another quarter of an hour. By the 4th hour, the kitchen brings barley mash with beans, and a man has 10 to 15 minutes to eat before technique with real weapons begins. The pause between blocks never exceeds 20 minutes, which is enough for heart rate to ease, yet not enough for core temperature to fall under armor. Compared with a modern practice that intersperses cooling and drinking protocols every 10 minutes, the historical schedule compresses effort and recovery to maximize throughput, and that compression costs water and salts that will not be fully replaced until dusk. Baths offer relief that looks helpful on the surface and becomes a new stressor by the minute. The circuit of frigidarium, tepidarium, and caldarium is designed for circulation and muscle relaxation, but the caldarium air often holds near 40 to 50 degrees Celsius with high humidity and water approaching 38 to 40 degrees Celsius. 10 minutes in such an environment move blood to the skin and away from the gut and legs, which feels loose and pleasant, but deepens dehydration by another 1 to 2% of body mass across a full circuit when no drinking accompanies the routine. The hippocaust beneath the rooms, heated by wood and charcoal, keeps floors warm, and fighters rest on benches that radiate heat into thighs and calves. A short cold dip at the end tightens vessels briefly, yet it does not refill plasma. The next step back into sunlit sand returns the body to load with less reserve. Heat on the arena follows a predictable arc with location differences. In Rome and Capua, the midday sun pushes surface readings of the sand above 35 degrees Celsius from late June through August, and reflected heat off the pale stone adds a perceptible layer around the shins and knees. In Pompeii, the amphitheater sits lower, and the bowl traps air that stands still when the breeze fails. So a late sequence after the 6th hour feels several degrees hotter than the same work in the yard. In the provincial amphitheaters of Gaul and Britain, air temperatures may stay nearer 20 to 25 degrees Celsius even in summer, but the wind strips sweat and cools the skin too quickly during pauses, which promotes calf cramps when work resumes. The net is similar. A man starts the afternoon without a true thermal neutral window, and muscles alternate between overheated and chilled states, each taking energy to correct. A concrete case from Capua shows the trade. A murmillo there wakes after a short night with stale air in the cell, rises before sunrise at roughly 24 degrees Celsius indoors, and moves to the yard by the 1st hour. 2 drills pass, and by the 4th hour he has eaten barley mash and takes a bath circuit to ease a tight lower back. 10 minutes in the caldarium smooth the spasm, yet they also raise skin temperature and pull fluids to the surface. He takes a quick cold plunge, dresses, and steps into the portico shade for 10 minutes, then gears up. The afternoon sun holds the courtyard near 32 degrees Celsius, and the first shield rush leaves him lightheaded in the 5th minute. The trainer calls a pause, then pushes him through forms to the end. The relief of the bath came at the cost of further dehydration, a cost that the next session forces him to pay with slower feet. Winter solves heat but brings a new indoor risk that touches both Rome and the northern provinces. Cells use braziers with charcoal, the small metal foculus, to warm air on cold nights when outdoor readings fall near 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. With the window shuttered and the door closed, the carbon monoxide level climbs, and a man wakes with a headache and a slower pulse response that lasts an hour. The bath in winter is less dangerous for dehydration and still risky when a fighter spends too long in the caldarium and then crosses a cold yard. In Gaul and Britain, the daily arc includes damp straw, colder floors, and heavier blankets that trap moisture, and foot skin softens overnight, and blisters sooner in morning drills. Thermal comfort thus shifts from overheating to overcooling, yet the result is the same. The body arrives at work outside its optimal band. The link between housing and performance shows in small metrics that compound. 8 hours in a warm cell raise resting heart rate by several beats per minute. 3 short drills with minimal shade raise core temperature by a fraction of a degree that persists into the meal. A bath that feels restorative drains another few hundred milliliters of sweat. A man who shares a 2 by 2.5 meter cell sleeps shorter and more fitfully than a man alone, and crowds around the bath and latrines increase wait time and reduce the chance to drink before gear up. In Pompeii and Capua, the day's architecture pushes bodies across narrow timing windows where a single misstep sets the afternoon up for cramps and dizziness. The school wins its timetable, and the fighter loses his margin. The next stressor follows naturally. Minor injuries become severe when thermal stress and tight quarters slow care. The micro-conclusion is direct. Stone cells that hold heat, a yard that stores sun, and bath circuits that trade muscle comfort for fluids combine to erode stability before the main work. The school routine maximizes control and spectacle readiness, not thermoregulation or sleep quality, and the result is predictable fatigue by the second session on hot days and chilled legs on windy days. From here, the chain moves to wounds and pathogens, because a body already hot, dry, or chilled manages bleeding and germs poorly. The next chapter traces injuries and infections from the first cut to the time it takes a medic to arrive and bind, measured in minutes that decide the next 48 hours. In the Ludus Magnus of Rome in the 90s of our era, the first medical threshold appears within the opening quarter hour after steel meets skin. The iron rim of a scutum can cut a forearm with a 5 to 7 centimeter slice, and sand drives into the tissue within minutes. A gladius thrust, even checked, leaves a puncture of 1 to 2 centimeters that bleeds under the leather guard. The school medic must cross the 50 to 100 meters of corridor quickly, because the first 5 to 10 minutes decide whether simple pressure suffices or whether cautery is needed. Under July sun at 32 to 35 degrees Celsius, blood flows faster and clots slower, and dehydration from the morning drill raises heart rate before care begins. The arena that entertains in 10-minute bursts generates wounds that demand control in the first hour, or the next day belongs to fever. Roman first aid is organized around compression, cleansing, and cautery, and the tools fit into a small chest. Forceps called valsella extract sand and grit, a bronze scalpel or scalpellum trims jagged edges, and a cautery iron seals vessels when a bandage fails to stop flow within 10 minutes. Bandaging uses wool or linen, the fascia, tied in firm layers that fix the pad and distribute pressure. Wine and vinegar serve as antiseptic washes in measures of a few ladles per wound, and honey or resin ointments seal the surface after bleeding slows. In a man of roughly 5 liters of total blood volume, 300 milliliters lost in the yard, and another 200 during transport tilt him into weakness by the second session. Without transfusion or modern hemostatics, the medic's window to keep loss below a half liter is measured in minutes, not hours, and training resumes only when the pulse drops below a safe mark. Joints and bones complicate the picture beyond visible blood. A shield rush dislocates shoulders with repetitive force, and the trainer knows the reduction steps that take less than 5 minutes when done early. Splints of wood, the ferruli, and leather thongs immobilize wrists and shins after a bad fall on the sand. The goal is 7 to 10 days of rest, yet the schedule compresses that to 2 or 3 days during festival weeks. Bruised ribs from a Sika strike cost breaths in sets of 3 to 5 per minute during work for several days, and a man who returns too soon breathes fast and shallow and tires at half pace. The yard's technique drills use wooden weapons heavier than steel by a third, and repeated shocks inflame tendons within a day. The injury that a farmer would rest for a week receives 1 night in the cell and a vinegar rub, and the next drill reopens the damage. Infections begin in the same sand that slows footwork. Animal dung from beast shows carries soil bacteria, and the most feared is the agent of tetanus that lives without air and enters through small punctures. The incubation often runs 8 to 12 days, yet the early hours define the chance to wash and debride before spores lodge deep. Cuts redden within 1 day when sand remains in place, and by the second day, heat, swelling, and a dull ache warn the trainer that a pause is needed. There are no antibiotics, so the medic leans on frequent washings with wine, salves of honey and myrrh, and exposure to air and sunlight between bandage changes. Fever above 38 degrees Celsius by the evening of the second day often means the next 48 hours decide whether the man returns to forms or moves to the infirmary for a week. A case from Capua shows the chain clearly. In the year 74 before our era, during the tensions that preceded the Spartacus revolt of 73 to 71, a Thracian trainee took a glancing cut along the thigh during a morning drill. The wound measured perhaps 6 centimeters and bled modestly, and a medic bound it with wool and vinegar within 15 minutes. The man returned to forms by afternoon and sweated through the bandage on a day near 30 degrees Celsius. That night, the cell stayed warm near 24 degrees Celsius, and the linen remained damp. By evening of the next day, the skin reddened and felt hot, and the trainer ordered rest and fresh washing. Without restock of clean cloth, the dressing reused after drying carried grit back to the cut, and the fever held for 2 days. The week's plan swallowed the man's stamina, and the next bout moved to someone else. Galen at Pergamon, around the years 157 to 161, recorded a program for gladiator care that combined diet and hands-on surgery. He favored early debridement of ragged edges with a sharp scalpellum, control of bleeders by pressure or ligature, and dry dressings after wine irrigation. He writes of ash water drinks to supply calcium, but in the yard his leverage was time to the wound, not recipes. He could reduce dislocations within minutes, and he used bandaging schemes that spread load, so a man could train with a protected limb within 2 or 3 days. The limit appeared with deep punctures and abdominal cuts. Here he noted that survival often depended on strict rest for 7 to 10 days, a rule that clashed with a schedule of public shows. The doctor stretched a fighter's career by months, but the arena could shorten it in 1 afternoon. Beast shows had unusual injuries and fast contamination routes. At the Grand Games of Trajan in the year 107, staged after the Dacian campaigns, the mix of venations and paired bouts increased encounters with claws and teeth. A cat bite to the forearm breaks the skin with 4 small punctures spaced a centimeter apart, and swelling begins within 12 to 24 hours if not irrigated vigorously. Boars gore with a tearing motion that leaves an irregular channel, and such wounds trap sand and feces deep in the track. The medic's practical rule is to widen and wash, which costs blood and time and forces a rest day during a schedule that wants a man back within 24 hours. Compared with neat blade cuts, animal wounds complicate the next week and raise the chance of abscess by the third day, a risk that climbs when travel delays care on provincial tours. Provincial amphitheaters in Gaul and Britain layer distance onto risk. A cut taken in late afternoon at Lutetia travels overnight on a cart for 20 to 30 kilometers before the troop stops, and bandage changes happen by torchlight with cold water rather than wine. In damp autumn air at 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, circulation slows and fingers stiffen during care, so knots set poorly and pads slip within an hour. By morning, the sand and mud picked up during loading have reached the wound edges, and swelling rises by midday. The difference from Rome is not knowledge, but logistics. The same medic who binds in 5 minutes in a corridor under the Colosseum needs half an hour on a road verge. The extra 25 minutes convert a simple half-centimeter cut into a 2-day problem, and a man misses drills he would have completed in the city. The micro-conclusion follows from minutes and miles. Most wounds taken in the yard or the arena can be controlled when compressing, washing, and binding begin within the first 10 minutes and continue in clean rooms across the next 2 days. The moment dehydration, heat, or travel stretch those intervals, blood loss grows, infection takes root, and the week's plan collapses. A fighter who reaches the 4th day with a fresh cut and no fever returns to forms. A fighter who misses that window yields his place and loses pay. The next stressor is not the body, but the tools and techniques that set loads hour by hour. Training weapons, armor mass, and repair cycles decide whether small injuries stay small or escalate, so the chain now turns to equipment, technique, and wear. At the Ludus Magnus in Rome in the 90s of our era, the daily threshold forms at the palace, the oak post set at a man's height in the yard. Fighters open with sets of 100 cuts per arm across 15 minutes, using a wooden rudies and a wicker practice shield that together outweigh the steel kit by roughly 1/3. The goal is to lift strength and make the real gladius and scutum feel light. The cost is early forearm fatigue and raw skin under the manica by the 10th minute. Sand adds resistance and robs push-off, so footwork consumes 10 to 20% more effort than on packed earth. After a short pause, the sequence repeats, and grip begins to fail even before steel appears. In practice, the first micro-injury often comes here, not in the show, and it compounds through the day when straps chafe and edges crack. Weapon classes fix what the body must move each minute. A murmillo carries a curved scutum of roughly 1 meter by 40 centimeters with mass near 7 to 10 kilograms, a helmet around 3 to 5 kilograms, greaves near half a kilogram each, and a gladius close to 1 kilogram. The whole set climbs toward 15 kilograms before water. A thraex trades the big shield for a smaller parmula near 3 to 5 kilograms and a curved sica that tears rather than pierces. The lower mass shifts cost to faster feet. A hoplomachus works with a hasta spear near 2 kilograms and a round shield that can cross 7 kilograms, steady yet tiring in the shoulder. The retiarius is lightest with a trident near 2 kilograms, a net of a few square meters weighing about 1 to 2 kilograms when dry, and a galera shoulder guard near a kilogram. He moves faster but bleeds sooner if caught. A secutor pays for defense with a smoother, more closed helmet that breathes poorly and traps heat by the 5th minute. Technique drills enforce patterns that feel simple and burn energy fast. A standard murmillo cycle layers shield presses in sets of 10, diagonal cuts along the palus, and short rushes of 3 to 5 steps at a time, repeated for 20 minutes with a pause of 10 minutes. The wooden rudies is deliberately heavier than a steel gladius by a third to a half, so wrists and fingers work at a higher torque, and the manica strap bites into the forearm as sweat builds. Trainers cue cadence by the water clock, and the goal is crisp form rather than speed, yet form breaks once grip slips by a few percent. On sand, a 5-pace rush ends with the sole sliding and a knee twist that costs the next drill. Compared with a gravel yard, the sand taxes calves and hips, and the day's third block arrives with slower feet and a higher pulse at rest. Maintenance is a second job that eats minutes and skin. Edges dulled by the palis need a whetstone pass that takes 5 to 10 minutes per blade, and a distracted fighter rounds the point too much and pays with poor entries later. Scuta use layered wood with a leather face and iron rims. The rim deforms after a dozen heavy clashes and must be hammered back or replaced in the shop behind the yard. Rivets loosen, straps stretch, and a loose grip adds a centimeter of play that lands as blisters within an hour. Helmets require oil against corrosion, sweat salts pit the iron within weeks, and a careless wipe leaves grit that abrades cheeks in the next session. Caligae soles lose nails after long days and need a quick refit, 5 minutes that vanish when the schedule runs tight. Every missed repair shifts load to skin and tendon and turns small pains into faults. A Rome case shows the load from a single helmet design. A secutor runs 5 3-minute exchanges against a retiarius before noon at 32 degrees Celsius. His smooth, near-closed helmet limits airflow and hearing, so he breathes hotter air and misses a faint whistle that cues a net throw. In the fourth exchange, his heart rate sits high, and narrow eye slits slow his lateral scan by a small but real margin. He leans harder into the scutum, now 8 kilograms after patches and wet leather admass, and his shoulder starts to burn. The next hour is for steel sharpening and strap checks. He rushes and leaves a chin strap stiff with salt. The afternoon bout lasts 8 minutes. The strap bites and locks his jaw, and his guard drops a hand's breadth. A trident prick opens the biceps with a shallow channel, not fatal yet primed for sand and sweat. Technique then gives way to maintenance debt. The provinces shift the same cycle onto rougher logistics. In Londinium or Eberacum, damp air swells shield boards and softens glue, and the parmula delaminates along a seam after a rainy march of 20 kilometers. The ludus there lacks a full forge. The smith heats rivets in a brazier and hammers under a lean-to, and repairs stretch to hours. Iron arrives by cart over days, not by a back door, and a broken rim may take a week to replace. Helmets rust faster in sea air, so oil rationing in winter leaves patches red and rough against the cheek. A retiarius net picks up mud, doubles in mass when wet, and throws slow by a handspan. The first cast misses, and fatigue builds. The show goes on with improvised kit, and the fighter pays with more slips and cuts that a full shop in Rome would have prevented within the same day. Training safety and show demands rarely align. Yard blades are not razor sharp and points are often blunted, yet impact still bruises bone through leather and wood. Show blades regain the point, and the Sika's inner curve opens longer channels that dress poorly. Mismatched kit magnifies errors. A new man given a scutum with a stretched grip overextends wrists on presses and inflames tendons by day's end. A hoplomachus who trains with a heavier spear than he fights learns to overcommit and stumbles on the real pace. Repairs skipped for schedule make edges catch and shields wobble, and technique that looked solid in the yard leaks energy on the sand. The trainer can see it by the 7th minute, but the editor's program does not stop for a strap or stone unless blood shows. One example from Capua underscores wear as destiny. A Thraex trains 3 blocks in the morning, roughly 45 minutes total, with a wooden Sika heavier by half than the show blade. The manica seam rubs raw skin near the elbow by the 3rd set, and he powders it with ash and ties tighter. Before midday, he files the steel Sika, replaces 2 rivets on the parmula rim, and oils a helmet hinge in 10 hurried minutes. Afternoon heat stands at 33 degrees Celsius, and the bout runs 9 minutes. In the 5th minute, the rim loosens again, the shield twists, and a gladius from a provocator scores along the exposed wrist. Bleeding is modest, yet the hand swells by evening, and the trainer scratches him from the next day. The chain began with a seam and a rivet and ended with a lost place and pay. The micro-conclusion is plain. Weapons set the hourly physics, and maintenance sets whether those forces land on iron or on flesh. Heavier practice kit builds reserve but taxes grip and skin. Closed helmets conserve vision paths and overheat the head. Rushed repairs return as slips, blisters, and poorly controlled impacts. In Rome, a full shop shortens the damage cycle. In the provinces, delays turn hairline faults into failures that carry into travel and the next week. From here, the constraints move off the yard and into rule and rank, because law, status, and discipline decide who carries which kit, who trains how long, and who pays for breaks in the schedule. In the Roman system of the 1st and 2nd centuries, the frame that breaks a fighter before noon is legal, not only physical. A man enters the school by 3 main paths: as a prisoner of war from campaigns like the Dacian Wars, as a condemned criminal under sentences such as damnatio ad ludos or damnatio ad bestias, or as an octoratus, a volunteer who signs for pay. The act binds him with an oath, the octoramentum, and drops his civic standing into infamia, which cuts rights in court and contracts for the duration. Paper or wax tablets record his name, type, and term, usually 3 to 5 years for a volunteer and open-ended for the condemned. The lanista, owner of the school, buys and rents bodies like tools. The editor, sponsor of the show, hires pairs by the day. Every link has a time window, a fee, and a penalty, and the fighter pays first when schedules slip. Discipline inside the ludus is a codified pressure that leaves marks you will not reset in a weekend. A missed drill in the 2nd hour brings verberatio, a measured flogging that leaves linear bruises and costs a day of speed. An attempted escape adds chains for nights and doubles duty at the palace for a week. Branding and tattooing exist as control signals rather than decoration. A slave marked as fugitivus is shaved and inked, and records in the office log his scars, height, and origin in digits of fingers and spans of hands. Curfew locks cells from the late evening to dawn. A guard holds keys and checks head counts by torchlight in strokes of the water clock. Compared with a modern club where discipline means loss of a bonus or a benching, here the cost is skin and time, which both move slower to heal under heat and sand. The law steps in at key points to limit cruelty, and one hinge is the lex patronia, cited in Rome in the 61st year of our era. Its rule narrows a master's right to send a slave to face beasts without a magistrate's consent, shifting the decision into public hands. The constraint does not stop games, yet it raises a gate that some cases do not pass. A practical example reads like a ledger entry. A cook who stole oil in an insula is proposed for the arena, the magistrate reviews, and the sentence is lowered to whipping and sale to a workshop. The school still fills its ranks, but the stream of casual victims slows, and editors lean more on trained pairs rather than raw executions. In practice, the law changes the mix on the sand and the risk profile in the yard, because trained men now carry more of the day's burden. Volunteers sign contracts that read like wagers with clauses. A typical term for an octoratus runs 3 to 5 years with a stipend spread across festivals, bonuses for palm victories, and a lump sum at manumission if the term is fulfilled. A default clause bites hard. Desertion costs a multiple of the advance, sometimes 2 or 3 times, and a body caught pays with irons and lost pay for months. The lanista recoups investment by booking the man in Rome, Capua, and provincial circuits, and a missed day triggers penalties that climb with distance from home base. An editor can demand stands misses, a standing dismissal, when both men have fought well and bleed without a clear outcome. It saves lives, yet preserves infamia and the contract clock. A fighter who strings 3 such days in a festival survives, but he carries debt on the ledger that the next month must clear. Freedom is a wooden sword with a price and a record. The rudies, awarded in a ceremony before the crowd, marks manumission and converts a fighter into a rudiarius. The gift often arrives after a set of seasons, not after a single famous day, and is logged with the man's name and the lanista's mark. A palmaris, a frequent winner, might reach such status after a handful of years, while a merely durable man earns it by surviving the term without serious breach. A case from Rome, near the 80th year of our era. A murmillo completes a season of festivals during the 100 days around the opening of the Flavian amphitheater, wins twice, receives stands misses once, and seals 3 contracts without default. The following spring he receives the rudies, then signs as a trainer and earns coin per week instead of per fight. The wooden blade is a legal pivot as much as a symbol. Punishments scale with breaches the way weights scale with rank. A small lie about an injury brings double sessions at the palace and docked barley rations for a week. Selling kit scraps for wine draws irons at night and a guard in the yard for a month. A man who strikes a trainer sees cold baths, chains, and a move to beast duties, a shift that raises his immediate risk by orders of magnitude. Damnatio ad bestias, as a sentence, lies outside the school's discipline and inside the courts. When it falls, the editor schedules the man into morning shows with boars or cats and sets it in paint on the day's boards. Compared with a volunteer's written term, a condemned man's time is elastic and often short, measured in a handful of appearances rather than years. The system teaches by pain and by loss of time, and both convert to worse performance on the sand. Crowd and editor temper the edge of death, but only within the day's script. In theory, the summa rudis, the senior referee, signals a halt when technique drops or blood flows from a vital spot, and the secunda rudis backs him with a staff and gestures. The editor can extend mercy with a thumb signal, and the crowd's noise shapes the choice in the last seconds. Mortality in regulated imperial pairs stays lower than the myths suggest. A minority of bouts end in death, often under 1 in 10 in city shows, with higher rates in poorly funded provincial days. Yet the same mercy that saves a life often returns the man to the yard within a week, and cuts that should rest for 10 days instead rush back to friction by day 3. Law mitigates, discipline compels, and the ledger demands the schedule. The system's origin shadows every rule. After the slave uprising led by Spartacus in the years 73 to 71 before our era, Rome tightened control over schools and movements, and the later imperial order kept the locks rather than loosened them. Records, brands, curfews, and escorts on the road define the perimeter as much as walls. A troop moving from Rome to Pompeii or Capua carries tablets that list names and statuses, and guards read them at city gates. The legal mesh catches deserters in hours inside the city and days on the roads. The penalty chain runs from flogging to the mines. A man who tests it learns that metal yields slower than skin and that a missed signature can cost a season. The micro-conclusion is simple. Law fixes entry, status, and exit. Discipline fills the hours between with penalties that turn minutes of error into days of loss. Lex Patronia shifts who arrives under the editor's hand. Contracts define who stays, and the rudies closes only after seasons that the body must survive. The next stress line lies on the roads and in the pens behind the gates, because transport, animals, fodder, and calendars decide where and when a man fights, and how tired he is when he steps on the sand. Behind the eastern flank of the Colosseum in the 90s of our era, logistics sets the first clock before a fighter even sees sand. The underground corridor from the Ludus Magnus to the arena runs roughly 50 to 100 meters, and a call from the editor's aide gives a window of 15 minutes to kit, form up, and march. Under Domitian, the Hypogeum machinery multiplied these clocks. Capstans, gangways, and cage lifts needed teams of men to raise doors in cycles of roughly 1 to 2 minutes, so late arrivals stalled an entire sequence. In practice, the Sumerudis could not begin a pair until a preceding beast release reached its mark under the stage, and any delay added heat and thirst to bodies held ready in the tunnel. The transport unit here is minutes, not miles, yet a quarter hour lost in a corridor steals the margin a man built with water at dawn. Beyond the corridor lay stone that turned to schedule. The Appian Way tied Rome to Capua over near 200 kilometers of paved surface, with posting stations every 10 to 15 miles where horses changed and carts rested. A troop on foot with kit carts moved 20 to 25 kilometers per day in summer and less in rain, so the trip filled 8 to 10 days for fighters and longer for heavy wagons that conserved axles by keeping speeds low. Each evening ended at a mancio with wells or a cistern. Water could top 3 to 5 liters per man per day in heat, and failure to refill pushed fatigue into the next morning. Compared with a modern bus that closes this distance in hours, the imperial timetable consumed a week and delivered men to Capua warmed by road dust, with leather straps stiff with salt and wooden rims swollen or split by sun. Animals turned distance into mass and hazard. A hungry lion eats several kilograms of meat per day and drinks several liters of water. A boar needs fodder more bulky than rich. Beasts sourced in North Africa or the Near East, shipped in cages by coastal vessels to Ostia, then moved upriver by barge to Rome or south by road to shows at Capua and Pompeii. Sea time from Carthage to Ostia under fair wind counted in several days. A storm doubled that and spoiled meat stocks, making the next unloading a rush. The grand games of Trajan in the year 107, staged after the Dacian Wars, drew many dozens of animals and thus dozens of wagons of fodder and water. Vivaria outside Rome held reserves, yet a festival week drained them quickly, so a missed barge or a broken cart forced substitutions that reweighted a program toward pairs and away from venaciones. The fighter downstream of that choice met a crowd primed for blood. Waterways and roads braided the same pressure. From Ostia, a barge pulled upriver to Rome in hours when the wind favored, and in most of a day when it did not, and crews sweated under sun that beat on planks without shade. Steel, shields, and nets rode in stacks that reached chest height, and a careless lash let wet leather shift and warp. Southbound travel to Pompeii often mixed road and coast. Wagons took the Appian Way for part of the route, while animals and heavy loads hugged harbors where coastal craft could hop between river mouths. The Pompeii amphitheater, in use by the 70th year before our era, sat near the town edge, so final delivery threaded narrow streets with wheels creaking and teams straining. 2 late carts on a market day turned a morning program into an afternoon start, and fighters held at readiness paid for each lost hour with thirst and slower legs. Provincial circuits in Gaul and Britain stretched the line thinner. From Lugdunum to the Channel, a troop followed the Agrippine roads over several hundred kilometers at 20 or so kilometers per day, then crossed from Gessoriacum to Dubris when wind and current allowed. A calm day gave a crossing in a handful of hours. A gale trapped ships for days, and men bunked in sheds with damp air near 10 to 15 degrees Celsius that softened foot skin and slowed the next march. In Britain, carts bogged on clay roads after rain, and replacement nails for caligae arrived by river with delays. Amphitheaters at Nemausus and later at Londinium lacked the dense back rooms of Rome, so repair shops improvised under awnings, and cages stayed in open yards that chilled beasts and men. The same pair that lasted 10 minutes under July sun in Rome fought shorter and colder in a provincial drizzle after 3 days on the road. Programs themselves were logistics in paint and grain. Notices of Munera, the shows funded by an editor, were brushed on walls in red letters with dates and the number of pairs promised. Pompeii preserves such announcements before the eruption of the 79th year of our era. A typical provincial program ran over 2 days, mixing beasts in the morning and pairs in the afternoon, with sequences strung by hand signs and drum cues. In Rome, under Domitian, the hippodrome's trapdoors and lifts added a precise order. Each animal cage rose at a mark, each reset took a minute or two, and a missed cue rippled forward. Behind that rhythm stood wagons with spare weapons, jars of water and posca, and stacks of fresh sand, perhaps several cubic meters per refresh. When sand clumped from blood and sweat, crews hauled new loads from nearby pits, and a cart broken on a curb delayed replacements by an hour the crowd never saw. One composite route sketches the where. A troop leaves Rome for Capua, 8 or 9 days on the Appian Way under July sun, then shifts 2 days later to Pompeii for a festival with beasts and pairs over 2 days. The second morning opens with boars, the afternoon brings 3 pairs, and the evening adds a finale promised on wall notices, a retiarius against a secutor under torches. The next dawn sees the troop back on the road, another 2 to 3 days to Capua, and then a week to Rome. A fighter walks 200 to 250 kilometers in 3 to 4 weeks, fights several 10-minute bouts, trains on off days, and works repairs in alleys behind mansions. Water intake swings with wells and weather. Sleep shortens in crowded lodgings. Kit cracks under travel vibration. By the time he steps again into the Ludus Magnus yard, his pulse sits higher at rest and his hands blister anew. The micro-conclusion ties minutes to miles. Logistics compress recovery into the gaps between carts, barges, and painted timetables, and any slip multiplies fatigue across days. Roads decide when a man eats, wind decides when he sleeps. A broken rim or a missed barge decides whether a promised beast becomes another hard pair. In Rome, careful corridors rescue timing. In the provinces, long distances and thin workshops turn small delays into lost blood and slower feet. The next constraint is coin, because pay, penalties, fodder, steel, and road tolls convert directly into choices that either widen or close the fighter's margins. Chapter 7 follows the money through fees, contracts, and prices, from the coins counted in the office of a lanista to the maximum price schedules that would later be pinned to walls in the year 301 under Diocletian. In the office of the Ludus Magnus in the 90s of our era, coin flows decide who fights and when. The lanista advances food, kit, and medical care, then charges fees to the editor who buys pairs for a day. Entries on wax tablets track denarii, sestertii, and the rare aureus. 1 denarius equals 4 sestertii, while 1 aureus equals roughly 25 denarii. A legionary's annual pay near this time stands around 300 denarii after Domitian's rise, and trainers use that figure as a yardstick when haggling over appearance money. A single provincial date can yield a purse equal to weeks of soldier wages, but travel eats the margin in fodder and repairs. The school's ledger sums this arithmetic by the festival, not by the hour, and a fighter learns that every late cart or cracked rim subtracts coin as surely as a lost bout. For a hired pair, the editor pays a package fee, then adds a scale of bonuses that depend on outcome and spectacle. An octoratus, a volunteer under contract for 3 to 5 years, might draw a fixed stipend paid across festivals and a win premium that can reach several hundred sestertii in Rome, less in Gaul or Britain. A palm victory recorded by the Summa Rudis raises the day's tally. A stands misses, a standing dismissal after a hard draw protects life yet trims the purse. On rare days, a crowd gift, the missio by the editor's signal, adds a small aureus or two, which equals a few dozen denarii, and closes the week's accounts in black. The condemned fight for rations and the hope of survival. The volunteer fights for the ledger's right side. The numbers look small in a quiet month, then grow fast when travel and wounds stack on the same page. Costs pull the other way with equal weight and less applause. A serviceable gladius can demand several denarii to forge and finish. A closed helmet climbs to dozens when good iron and a careful hinge are required. A large scutum costs a handful of denarii to build and more to keep its rim true after a week of clashes. Leather straps, oil, whetstones, nails for caligae, and linen for bandages consume sestertii every day, and the medic's chest must be stocked with wine, vinegar, and honey. Fines exist and look minor on paper, such as the loss of a day's bread or a docked fraction of stipend for missed drill. Yet their steady bite equals a small purse by month's end. A man who breaks a rim and skips repair adds a hidden tax because blisters and slips cost bouts, and bouts pay the rent. The school recovers advances first and pays bonuses last. Editors buy prestige by the wall and the day, and the price climbs with each promise. A 2-day munus in Pompeii, announced in red letters before the 79th year of our era, lists beasts in the morning and pairs in the afternoon. The total outlay reaches into many thousands of sestertii once animals, transport, sand, water, and kit repairs are added. In Rome, during long festivals, budgets rise further because the crowd expects rare beasts and complex stagecraft under Domitian's improved hypogum. A late barge from Ostia or a sick cat forces substitutions that save the schedule and reshuffle money. The editor trims beast costs and fills with more pairs, which raises the burden on schools and spreads pay thinner. A rich man can spend a year's urban income in a week of games and win a statue. A poor town copies the form with fewer pairs and leaves men tired for half the pay. Animals and roads are accounts that do not argue and never forget. A lion eats several kilograms of meat per day. A boar needs bulky fodder and handlers. Each cage on a cart drags a team that burns money with every mile. Stagehands, gate crews, and lift teams in the Colosseum take daily wages that add up over 10 or 20 days. Sand haulers and water carriers charge by the backbreaking load. In Gaul and Britain, carts bog in autumn mud and double the time on the road, so inns and mansions collect more fees for beds and fodder. A single broken wheel outside Nemausus turns a morning show into an afternoon start and shifts drinking and eating windows late, which then increases injuries and doubles the medic's bill. The ledger shows this as lines of small outflows, yet the fighter feels it as cold meals and shorter sleep that degrade the next bout. The imperial economy supplies a late but clear measuring stick. In the year 301, the Edict of Maximum Prices under Diocletian tried to cap wages and goods across provinces, listing maxima by denarii in long columns. It is later than the Julio-Claudian and Flavian shows, yet it preserves orders of magnitude that help sense the older sums. A day of common labor sits at a few dozen denarii in the schedule. Basic footwear and coarse garments stand in the same band. A measure of grain is set around the low hundreds. Translating back is imperfect because coin silver shrank and inflation ran high, but the ratios still guide the eye. A fighter learns that food, leather, and labor were the heavy lines even when prices float. Rare beasts, fine iron, and long travel simply stress the top. The cap made headlines, and the market found detours within months. Risk capital lives in flesh, and schools price it with caution and hope. A strong prisoner of war bought after the Dacian campaigns might cost the school several thousand sestertii when transport and food are counted, which equals many seasons of a legionary's wage. A convicted man costs less and lasts fewer dates. A volunteer who signs for years carries a bonus and a buyout clause that returns coin if he deserts. Insurance exists only as practice and reserve. A lanista keeps a bench of capable men to backfill injuries and takes advances from editors before a festival week. The math is not romantic. A single death in a city show can erase a month's margin. 3 good draws in a row can set a stable's accounts right until winter. Across Rome, Capua, Pompeii, and provincial circuits, the arithmetic favors patience, maintenance, and men who can fight often rather than wild finishes. Personal finances decide whether a man sees freedom, because freedom costs coin and time. A rudarius earns steady pay as a trainer, less stress and more days, and can save toward a house share or a workshop stake over 3 to 5 years. A current fighter risks losing that future with 1 torn wrist or lost tooth in a poor town that pays late. Medical care consumes coin invisibly because a man sidelined loses appearance money and still eats and sleeps under the school's roof. Wounds that require a week off shift a month's ledger from black to red unless a crowd gift or a rich editor intervenes. Bets run in the stands and in nearby taverns in tens and hundreds of sesterti, and a man sees none of that unless a patron slips him a coin after a hard day. Money from wagers moves fast. Money from contracts moves slow. The micro-conclusion closes the loop. Coins set the pace as surely as water and heat, because pay, penalties, and prices decide how often a man fights, how well he repairs, and how long he can plan ahead. A purse that looks healthy at noon can vanish by dusk under fodder, travel, and fines. A steady month with small bonuses and low repairs saves a season. The next constraint is the air that surrounds the ledger, signals, rumors, and the crowd's will. Referee staffs, editor gestures, drum cues, and shouted odds steer seconds on the sand and sway mercy and money. Chapter 8 turns to communications and the arena's psychology, from hand signs under the sun to crowd waves in Gaul and Britain, where a wrong gesture in 1 second rewrites the next 48 hours. Under the eastern stands of the Colosseum in the 90s of our era, the first communication threshold appears within the opening minute, before steel moves. Trumpets and curved horns mark the change of sequence. The summa rudis with a wooden staff sets the start by gesture. The editor watches from the pulvinar and times entries against the flow of cage lifts below. Sound rolls across stone in waves that arrive a heartbeat late, and men in closed helmets hear less than the crowd hears. A misread tap of the staff or a horn held 2 breaths longer makes a pair step early or late, and the next door in the hippodrome hesitates for 1 or 2 minutes as crews reset. The result is heat and thirst swelling in the tunnel while eyes search for the next cue. On days packed with many pairs, these slips multiply and shorten the margin for mercy at the end. Tools and hands translate rules into action. The summa rudis and the secunda rudis carry staves that fix distance and warn with a light strike on shield or shoulder when form collapses. Hand signs call for a pause, for space, or for a clean reset of grips. Another set summons the medic or points to a fault that costs position. The editor uses thumb and hand to signal dismissal or continuation, with forms that vary by school and era and cannot be reduced to a single modern picture. A staff lifted at the wrong angle can look like a halt from one side and like an urging forward from another, especially to a secutor peering through narrow slits and breathing hot air. In practice, a vocabulary of a dozen clear gestures keeps order when all goes well, and confusion arrives when dust rises and bodies crowd the center. Acoustics decide seconds, and seconds decide blood. In Rome, the high cavea throws shouts back toward the floor. A wave of sound takes a breath to build, then pushes like a wall. In Pompeii, the lower bowl traps voices and makes them overlap, so commands blur into a constant hum by noon in summer. In Gaul and Britain, wind cuts across the bowl and strips trumpet notes into fragments, while a light rain turns sand dark and deadens footfalls that judges read for balance. A late horn or a muffled staff tap means a strike continues through what should have been a pause. The difference between a shallow slice and a deeper channel is often that half-second of missed stop, and a man carries the cost for days. Now arenas use whistles and radios, then men read wood against wood and a hand against sunlit air. Bets and rumor form a second channel that pulls at minds while hands work. Chalk tallies in taverns near the gates and fast talk by runners in the arcades move odds through the day, and a strong first exchange can shift stakes by dozens of sestertii within minutes. A fighter knows that a surge in the crowd's tone brings pressure for blood or for a standing dismissal, and the editor hears it as clearly as the judges. In the second half of a festival afternoon, when purses thin and tempers rise, a man feels the ring close when he tries to draw breath or widen space. One afternoon in Capua, a murmillo slowed in the 7th minute, and the arcades roared for continuation. The Sumerudis hesitated a heartbeat to verify the cut, and the next rush opened a second line on the forearm. The wound cost 2 days and a purse, and the rumor that he had asked for an easy end ran ahead of him to the next town. Programs themselves are written communications with hard edges. In Pompeii, before the eruption, in the 79th year of our era, red-letter wall notices promised beasts in the morning and pairs in the afternoon, listing days and numbers like a public contract. Change of plan after a broken cart or a sick cat had to be shouted by criers at the gates and whispered through the arcades, and not all ears heard. A pair that expected the 3rd hour found itself thrust into the 2nd, with 1 fewer rest and a shorter time to drink. The same boards named editors and sponsors whose honor rode on delivery to the letter, and late starts cut reputations as surely as they cut purses. Now a schedule updates on a board, then it lived in paint and lungs, and any error walked straight into the arena. Provincial amphitheaters added dialect and weather to the noise. In Nemausus, where summer heat pressed under the stones, local stewards cued by drum rather than horn on busy days, and the beat vanished in echoes under the arches. In Londinium or Eboracum, wind from the west broke trumpet lines, and a retiarius judged the net throw by a referee's shoulders rather than by sound. One wet afternoon in Britain, a secutor stepped on an early beat, and the net flew across a judge's staff rather than across the lane. The tangle took seconds to clear and raised tempers higher than the rain had, and the exchange that followed ran faster and wilder than the school taught. Logistics had brought them cold and late. Communication made them hurried. The margin for a controlled end was thin before the first touch. Inside the school, messages measure days as surely as coins do. Water clocks in the office mark hours for drills, baths, and meals. Guards carry keys and call names by lamplight at curfew. A slate lists pairs for the next morning with marks for kit checks and wounds. A missed name on the slate draws a fine by sunrise and extra sets at the palace. An erased mark for a repair becomes a loose rim by afternoon. Notices for provincial tours move from chalk to tablets once coin changes hands, and a man who fails to answer a road roll call meets irons for nights and a docked stipend. Compared with a modern roster on paper and glass, this system uses wood, clay, and memory, and every slip creates a new punishment that in turn creates new fatigue. The link from message to skin is direct. Imperial signals eventually silence the arena altogether. In the 404th year of our era, the Emperor Honorius issued an order to end gladiatorial combats in Rome, part of a longer arc that had already reduced shows in many towns. The reasons ran from budgets and priorities to changing religious attitudes and military pressures on the frontiers, but the effect was simple. The chain of horns, staves, and crowd waves broke above the floor. A profession built on minutes of steel under a painted program became a memory carried by mosaics and texts, and schools faded or turned to training for staged hunts. For a man inside our period, this future did not exist. For us, it frames the limit of the system we are measuring. The micro-conclusion closes the ring. Signals start bouts, steer seconds, and decide ends. Rumors and bets pull minds. Acoustics and weather bend commands. Programs in paint fix expectations that bodies must meet. A misread gesture or a late horn converts to deeper cuts, lost purses, and longer recoveries, and the same crowd that grants mercy can demand pace beyond safe form. With communications mapped, the chain returns to the sum of limits. Shall I move to the conclusion and draw the final lessons from water, heat, wounds, kit, law, roads, coin, and the crowd?